This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke, and this week we are going to talk about Izanami. Now, Izanami is a goddess. Her name means she who invites, and she is a goddess of creation, but she also has an association with the underworld. Now, there's a long story written in this text. I'm trying to think what it's called. I have a book of Japanese tales and legends, and I don't have the name of the original source for this. Let me see if it tells me what it is. If I can just go to the bottom here and see. Okay. Yeah, doesn't give me the name of the original source in Japanese. However, I alluded to this story in my segment on the Oni, on the female Oni, when I talk about the hags who are sent to chase after Izanagi, the husband, who is the creator god, who creates the world, starting, of course, with the Japanese islands, once there is a firmament that is created. Izanami actually experiences death. She's not immortal. So when she goes to the underworld and takes the food of the underworld, she becomes one of the dead. And he of course, goes to the underworld to try to retrieve her, but then she tells him not to look upon her form, but then finally he does. He smells something awful, and then he goes and he looks and finds that she is now like a rotting corpse with maggots and things, and he, of course, immediately runs away in fear, and she, gets very angry, not only that he broke his promise, but that he looked upon her in that form. So he chases after. He sends 8 hags after him that we had spoken about. The Hishome, and again, the number 8 is there. Now we're going to see the number 8 as a repeating theme in this particular story, and I want to talk about what that means. But what I'd like to do for this particular episode is give the full story of Izanami and Izanagi, which I think is important for context. And I'm going to read it from a book I have called Japanese Tales and Legends. And going to go into the details of all those stories, and then I want to talk about the different nuances of that story, because they have a lot to say about, they have meanings that go beyond perhaps the obvious social connotations of the story itself. So let me go back to the beginning here. Okay. So, Izanagi and Izanami. Let me put my book down here so I can look at it easily. As time passed, 3 gods were born in the high plane of heaven. I'm going to make sure I say these right. Amano Minaka Nushi, god of the august center of heaven. Takami Musubi, high august god of growth. And Kamimi Musubi, divine august god of growth. These 3 gods looked at the earth below. They saw no order there. Everything was in confusion. There was no sign of growth or life on the ponderous, inert mass. They looked and contemplated long, and consulted among themselves as to what could be done to give it order and life. Even if we talk until our strength drains from us, we are powerless to change these matters, they said in despair. Almost in answer to their anxious wonderings, a new race of young, virile gods appeared in the high plane of heaven. They were sent by the Lord of Heaven, whose divine presence was felt throughout Takamagahara, and who, the sages relate, was the very creator of Takamagahara itself. The young gods joined in the consultations with the 3 elder deities, and after long deliberations, it was decided to send 2 of the youngest and fairest to the earth below to subdue the chaos and create beauty upon its turbulent face. The name of the first young god chosen for this gigantic task was Izanagi, and he was tall and strong as a willow sapling. His companion was named Izanami, and she was delicate in speech and manner, and as beautiful as the air that filled the high plane of heaven. All agreed that none was more suited for the task, in bravery and fairness, than Izanagi and Izanami. When the choice was made, the Lord of Heaven called the 2 young gods to him and said, You have seen the chaos of the earth below us. For too long now it has been in that state, spineless and inert as a giant jellyfish floating in a sea of space. There is no birth, no growth, no order, just darkness and misery. Go therefore, my children, to your great labor. Draw together the lighter parts and unite the heavier parts. So dispose of them that there is pleasure in the contrast between them. Create order where there is none, and in place of anarchy let there be laws of growth and development. It is for you, my children, to make for me a worthy and beautiful country of the earth. When the Lord of Heaven finished speaking, he handed Izanagi a finely carved spear, surmounted by an ornamented jeweled ball of unsurpassed magnificence and rare beauty. It was no other than the legendary spear Amano Nuboko, one of the greatest treasures of the high plane of heaven. This spear is my symbol, said the Lord of Heaven, and with it you will achieve all. As the two young gods bowed reverently, the Lord of Heaven raised his hand, and in the wondrous space over the high plane of heaven, a pinpoint of light appeared. It drifted down like a solitary small circle of foam riding on the sea of the sky. As it came nearer, all saw that it was a white ball of cloud, surrounded by an escort of smaller clouds, whose fringes were as colorful as the high plane of heaven itself. It came to rest at the throne of the Lord of Heaven, who said to Izanagi and Izanami, "This is your carriage, and on it you may journey through space at your will. Now it is time for you to be going." Izanagi and his beautiful companion stepped onto their carriage of clouds, and all watched intently as it sank towards the earth below, bearing its heavenly passengers. As they receded gradually from the sight of the watching gods, a rainbow arc of light appeared and curved from heaven to earth in bands of many colors. It was the bridge of heaven, and Izanagi and Izanami were bathed in its radiance as they descended. Okay, so before I go on to the next section, I just want to stop there for a minute. A couple of things. First of all, the idea, we have this idea of turning chaos into order, and the idea of applying laws. Okay, there's something about this. Now, Confucianism is really more of a Chinese thing. The Japanese at this point were certainly religiously more Shinto, and you also see elements of Taoism. This is a story that I wouldn't associate it with their Buddhist period, but I think it's, so you have this element. So you have this idea when they're talking about what to do with the heavier and the lighter and how to move things and how to move things. There's a very Taoist element to that, the idea. And there's this idea of balancing, which I think is going to be important. But also the idea of law as somehow being a balancing force, which you can see this idea appearing in Confucianism, which believes that social order and law and following one's societal role is the way to achieve harmony. And certainly Eastern religion in general has been about the way in which one balances various elements to create harmony, to remove blocks or to put things in different places. Also, the idea of the earth as being like a jellyfish. Okay, so there's the idea of not having a solid foundation, of being kind of weak and flaccid. And it jumps into my mind right now, this could also be sort of the representation of a flaccid penis or something like that. And if you think that that's a little far-fetched, you have to wait till we get into the next part of the story. So the next part of the story is called the Bridge of Heaven, which, as we can obviously see, is a rainbow. Okay. Izanagi and Izanami floated downward until they were level with the highest point of the rainbow. There they halted, and hand in hand stepped from their cloud carriage onto the colored bridge. They paused and looked about them. Above was the bright blue of the vaulted heavens, but below all was dark and still. As the rainbow curved from them into the distance, it disappeared in dense fog, and they could see nothing of the floating mass of earth. They stood gazing about them for some time, and Izanagi said to Izanami, "We must descend through the fog below, for there lies the earth in our task." Holding each other's hand, and with Izanagi's grasping the spear, I'm saying this wrong, Amanobuko, sorry, I'm destroying my rhythm here, they set off down the bridge of heaven. Soon they were enveloped in fog so thick that all about them was the darkness of night. But on they walked until they reached the end of the bridge. Here they paused. Both were greatly troubled, for they could see nothing and feel nothing but the touch of each other's hands. "Is this then the earth?" Izanami asked anxiously. Izanagi did not answer, but plunged his spear into the swirling fog. The spear's another factor, speaking of phallic symbols. It sank easily, and Izanagi turned and probed with it once more, hoping to find some firm ground for a foothold, but there was none. He plunged it again and again in every direction, but everywhere the fog yielded without resistance to its thrust. Alas, he said dejectedly, it is like a jellyfish, as our Lord of Heaven said. But no sooner had he spoke that the fog began slowly to evaporate and light flowed about them. And by the way, this idea of fog would also indicate a lack of form or clarity, so I just want to mention that. A tremor shook the spear in his hand, and he saw that a clot of mud clinging to the tip was slowly detaching itself and falling from it. Then, miraculously, several more clots grew and followed the first. And as the mud grew and fell, it massed together, and the water poured from the spear's point and flowed gently round the edges. As the last traces of the fog dispersed, the sky grew brilliantly light. The two young gods looked down from the bridge of heaven. Everything shone with the reflected blue of the heavens, and in the midst of the void beneath them lay an island surrounded by a calm blue sea. Holding each other's hand tightly, they watched this divine miracle. Without speaking, Izanagi lifted the spear and probed the island in different parts. "It is firm, Izanami! It is firm!" he cried excitedly, turning his head and holding the spear before her. "The divine spear has wrought this." They looked again at the island and beneath them, and both were filled with joy. Suddenly, Izanami cried eagerly, "Let us go and explore in its every corner." Before Izanagi had time to answer, she had stepped from the bridge of heaven onto the warm white sands of one of the beaches. Izanagi followed her, and both were jubilant to feel the earth beneath their feet and hear the lapping of the sea among the tongues of rocks, which embraced the white beach. They walked the island from end to end. Everything filled their eyes with joy, and before the expanse of ocean surrounding their new land, they stood spellbound. "It is a very small, our island, but it is enchanting. Is it not?" said Izanami, but Izanagi only laughed with happiness in reply. They came to a small plateau, and as they rested side by side watching the heavens above, Izanami suddenly said, "Izanagi, we are the first gods from the high plane of heaven to put foot on earth. This is to be our home for always. Let us build a shrine on this plateau, where we can serve the great gods and spend our lives in peace." Izanagi was delighted with the idea and said, "Indeed, indeed, we will build it with our own hands, and its center we will build a column that will rise to heaven. This is a great pillar of heaven. Then we shall always feel close to our former home." They both knelt down and raised their eyes to the high plane of heaven, begging the gods to bless and help their endeavors. Day after day they labored. The shrine slowly took shape, and the great column in the center stretched to the skies. When at last their work was done, Izanagi and Izanami made formal preparations for its dedication. They had chosen names for the island, the shrine, and the column. Naming, by the way, is important. For comparison, go back to Genesis, where Adam is sent to name all of the things of the earth. And kneeling, they prayed earnestly that the shrine might be sanctified by the august Lord of Heaven. To the island they gave the name, the island of Onokoro. The shrine they named Yashirodono, or the Palace of the 8 Fathoms. Okay, there's your 8 again. And the column, Amanohimashira, the august pillar of heaven. I hope I said that correctly. The naming done, a great peace fell upon them. The air grew still, and the tide ceased its sound. The light of evening embraced land and sea. Izanagi and Izanami bent their heads in reverence, for they knew that their prayers had been heard. Okay, so once again, we see the 8. We see the idea of building. We see the idea of building towards heaven. And then we see the concept of naming. And of course, naming something is where power comes from, where manifestation comes from. So we see them doing this. So and I believe there is also a naming ceremony that takes place. You hear about this in certain Eastern religions. I'm just thinking of it now, and that's why I have no details about it in front of me. But nonetheless, the importance of naming and the importance of naming an individual. Why some places, I know certainly in India, there's the idea of the numerology of the name is very important. You know, that your name has a quality that is auspicious to you, and that is harmonious with your Vedic chart and everything else. So we have this idea of naming, which manifests and solidifies. Okay. The birth of the islands. This is the next section. Time passed on the beautiful island. In every direction stretched a vast blue sea of space. Izanagi often stood on the island's highest point, wondering if a visitor from heaven might not honor them with his presence. One day, as he gazed and pondered, clouds of fog and mist began to rise up all around, and the seas began to churn and boil, and the waves to dash themselves against the island shores. But even as he watched, the mist began to clear, and a shining roof, for it such it seemed, emerged above him. It was the sky, separating itself at long last from the oceans, and now filling the vault of heaven with its light. Izanagi was filled with joy at this sight and called loudly to Izanami, come quickly, a new world is coming to birth." Izanami, hearing his cries, came running to him. Together they looked and marveled, and the beauties of the island revealed themselves anew to the young couple. Then Izanagi spoke. When we were sent from Takamagahara to this lower world, the Lord of Heaven turned it from a spongy mass into this firm and lovely earth. He did so that we might live here and create goodness and beauty in place of chaos. This island that we have named Onokoro is fair and enchanting, but it is very small. We must beg Heaven's help to build larger islands that the world may grow and increase. He spoke in a voice full of deep emotion, for he was already filled with the vision of his new creation. Taking Izanami by the hand, he led her to the shrine, and there they prayed fervently for blessings on their task. At last they rose from their knees, and Izanagi, turning to speak to Izanami, suddenly paused. Izanami, he said, to create those other islands, we must become man and wife. We must circle the earthly column, you to the right and I to the left, so when we meet, we shall know each other truly. So both walked round the column, and Izanami turning to the right and Izanagi to the left. When they met on the farther side of the column, Izanami spoke first and said, "How delightful it is to meet so sweet a youth." And although Izanagi replied, "I am overjoyed at meeting so fair a maiden," there was displeasure in his voice. Nonetheless, they embraced and became man and wife, but there was no joy between them any longer. In time, Izanami bore her divine husband a son, but to their dismay, he was weak and boneless like a leech. "This is surely the result of the Lord of Heaven's displeasure with me," said Izanagi. "We must not keep this child. It is an ill omen." He placed the baby in a boat of reeds and sent it adrift in the ocean. For many days both were depressed and unhappy. Then one morning the young husband, after consulting with the gods in the high plane of heaven, said to his wife, "The gods are displeased because you spoke first when we met after circling the heavenly column. Man must take precedence over woman." You like that? They said, "Therefore we must circle it again." They both walked to the column, and when they had circled it before, Izanagi spoke first and said, "The gods are kind to me in putting in my way so wonderful a maiden." And Izanami replied, "I am beloved by the gods who have allowed me to meet so divine a youth." They both gazed on each other for a long time. They were filled with a strange wonder, and a profound change came over them. They began to feel a sense of unity with the earth around them, and a new love for each other was born in them. That evening, the two young demigods, for they had now become part of the earth around them, talked eagerly of the new islands that they hoped to create, and both prayed earnestly for help. And they knelt before the shining column. The sky began to glow with warm gold radiance. The majestic sun dropped slowly across the arch of heaven. Redder and redder the light fell on the sea. The waves sent back reflections of purple, rose, and blue. The shadows lengthened and darkened. The sun glowed with deepest crimson as it fell. The island was irradiated with warmth, and the column shone with an unearthly light as it speared the sky. As the sun was quietly swallowed by the depths of the vast ocean, the waves were touched momentarily with its last rays, and the crests rose and fell in cascades of stars, with swelling and eddying of the billows. All became dark, and a blackness of ebony fell over the sea, wrapped the island in its folds. There was not a sound, and over all was utter stillness. In the shrine, Izanagi and Izanami knelt, intent and dedicated. But the stillness was a harbinger of a coming storm. Soon the ocean began to rise and swell, and gradually the waves grew more and more mountainous. The air grew noisy with the sound of the rolling tide, and the winds churned the water into angry whirlpools. All through the night the seas roared and thundered, but towards dawn all quieted again and lay still. When Izanagi and his wife came out of the shrine, they were so transfixed. Before them stretched the long, curving shores of a vast island, and on the far horizon were the shapes of others. In great joy the two set out to view their new domains. From island to island they went, marveling at each new land, and when they had traveled them all, they found that there were 8. So they gave them their names in the order of their birth first. Okay, so he mentions all the names. I'm not going to read all those. Together they were called the country of the 8 great islands. As time passed, they became known as Japan. Okay, so we see the 8 connected with the 8 islands of Japan as well. I should also mention that their son, let me see, I wanted to find the information. He becomes, the child is called, the boneless child is called Hiruko, and became known as Shintoism as the god Abisu. And as a god, Abisu, I want to say, was the, let me just find it in here. Yes, who become one of the patron of fishermen and one of the 7 gods of good luck. So in spite of the fact that this inauspicious child was sent away, this child becomes more connected with the oceans. But that takes on an interesting, the mythology takes on an interesting inflection, because it suggests that these boneless creatures are somehow inferior in some way or the result of something inauspicious. But yet at the same time, when we talk about the fish and fishing and elements of that, I'm thinking, for example, of the image of the dragon in both, in Far Eastern mythology, tends to be very auspicious. So this particular leech boy, as they call him, actually becomes auspicious. But the idea of the child as a leech, there's also this, when we think of a leech, we think of a parasite. We think of something that just drains life, that doesn't actually, in order to take its life, it drains other life. So to me, there's almost I'm not going to, obviously they're not, these are not connected. I'm not trying to compare them and say, oh, they're the same thing. But I think of the biblical inflection of the imperfectness of nature. So there's this first try that happens, but it's because the female speaks first. Now, that just sounds it sounds very sexist, like the man has to do everything first. But if you think about it, again, in Taoist terms, you have this idea that the yang or the masculine principle is associated with action, whether the feminine is passive. So that, and so remember when I said earlier about the jellyfish is like a flaccid penis, there may be a sense of this sun being flaccid is somehow being effeminate or being, it's like something that's not firm. Okay. It's sort of a penis-shaped thing, but not firm. So there's, so you see this idea, this negative feminine idea, or the idea that something is out of balance because the masculine, because the feminine principle initiated the action, the results are more flaccid and boneless. They're not as solid. Okay, so just something to think about in terms of, again, looking at it from that Taoist point of view. But of course, like a lot of these myths, they unfortunately become, connected to the, they end up becoming connected to the social roles and social views of men and women. Probably not correct. I mean, again, I personally, I put that forward as a critique of the culture. People within the culture, who might still follow those kind of narratives might have a different way of looking at it. But to me, that would be a potential social critique there. That said, I do think that the meaning goes beyond the social. So, that said. Okay. So, more and more islands appeared, and every day Izanagi traveled the land and sea watching over them. Sometimes Izanami went with him, but serving in the shrine took up much of her time, and she found the long journeys exhausting. One day Izanagi said to her, "Izanami, my dear wife, now that we have all these beautiful islands around us, our work is greatly increased. I see that you are sometimes very tired, and it troubles me. What would you like to do in order to refresh yourself? I beg you not to work so hard." Izanami bowed her head and listened submissively when her husband spoke. Then she answered in gentle tones, "My dear husband, there's nothing I wish to do more than live here with you in peace and contentment. But now that we have so many islands born, I pray that we too may bear children for our help and delight." Her prayers were answered. In the years that followed, many children were born to them. The first was a sea spirit, the next a mountain spirit, and then in succession all the spirits of fields, trees, rivers, and all natural things. Under their care and guidance, the islands grew more verdant and beautiful. Soon the seasons were born, and the breaths of the winds, rains brought their changing cycles to the mountains and fields. Everywhere the forests grew thick and dense, and the groves flocks of birds gathered and sang. Crops and harvests multiplied, and flowers and bushes blossomed in profusion. Izanagi and his wife lived the utmost contentment among their family, and when a daughter was born to them, who was a goddess of the sun, their joy was unbounded. She was beautiful and radiant being, and her whole body gleamed and shone with such resplendent luster that everywhere she went she filled the darkest air with light and brilliance. Her they named Amaterasu. Soon after, a moon god was born to them, and he too shone with a light, next only to the sun in splendor. His radiance was mellow and pale, and he walked among the dark shadows of evening, dispersing them with quiet rays. Him they called Tsukiyomi. When a sea god was born to them, his silvery green body reflected in changing hues the resplendent light that shone from his brilliant brother and sister. One day, as Izanagi and Izanami were talking together, a sudden thought struck Izanagi, and laughingly he said, "Izanagi and Izanami, among all our wonderful children, there is not one who truly represents fire. Our daughter Amaterasu is a sun goddess, it is true, but we need a fire god himself to live close to us. Let us pray that he may be born to us." This time when their prayers were answered and a fiery, powerful son was born to them, who they named Kagutsuchi, the god of fire. But his birth proved too much for the mother, and her body was partly consumed in the burning heat of her fire god child. Alarmed at this unforeseen disaster, Izanagi ran to her side to comfort and tend her. He prepared her for her special foods and medicines, but in her agony and sickness, whatever she attempted to swallow was immediately rejected. And lo, it was from these rejections that the gods and goddesses of metals were born, while from other parts of her body the god and goddess of earth issued forth. But now her body lay completely perished, and Izanami passed away. Death had come to the world for the first time, and with it its earthly companion, grief. Now, we're going to get into Izanami's descent into the underworld in a minute, but I would like to comment on that. Okay, first of all, you've got two creator deities who are listed as demigods. Okay, so they are mortal. They can die. Which is interesting because, most of the time we think of the gods as immortal. But you also might think about the fact that they are creating the material world, and one of the attributes or qualities of the material world is that everything in it perishes. Okay, so that might be, that may be why you're talking about two deities that, in theory do not live forever. The other thing, okay, the fire god, they give birth to the sun and the moon. Now, there's other versions of this myth where Izanagi gives birth to these deities by himself, okay? You have a masculine moon, which is not necessarily uncommon in the Far East. India, you also have a masculine moon. But then you have this god of fire who is born and who burns the mother. And again, it's the idea of the passive feminine, which is associated with water and associated with, is much more, again, there's definitely more of a water quality, that the fire actually becomes too much for that particular yin element. So she dies. Now, the other thing I think of, in the fact that in her death you have things that become the firmament, you could think back again to Tiamat when her body is chopped up, that she becomes the firmament. And I also think of the immolation of Shakti in Hinduism, where, the parts of her body fall in different places and create. Now, they don't necessarily say it creates things, but here you see this is where metals and so forth come from this immolation of the creator, of this feminine force, okay, when she's immolated, and that's the closest parallel that I can see there. I mean, I don't think the stories historically inform each other or anything, but it's an interesting idea about this almost decaying feminine force that produces these heavier elements, and it also speaks to the danger of fire. If we think of the way that the Shakti force works, this is kind of a powerful feminine. But see, she's a powerful feminine force, but this is also when she is facing up to the world of death, which we think of death as theoretically diminishing power, but just as we see those Mahavidyas associated with cremation grounds and things like that, there's that removal that also unleashes a very, very potent force. So, just some thoughts on that. Okay, so now we're going to get to Izanagi's descent into the underworld. They say Hades in this book, but it'd be interesting to think about Yomi, which is the underworld in Japanese mythology. I just want to look at that. Yeah, the shadowy land of the dead is what Yomi means. And now we're going to see a myth here, or a story that's very similar to that of what we think of as Orpheus and Eurydice in the Greek. There's also, you're going to see connections between the myth of Persephone and Hades in this particular myth as well. It's not the same story. I'm just pointing out that there's going to be similarities. So let me read this story to you. Izanagi was filled with sorrow and loneliness. Through the countless years he and his divine sister-wife had subdued the chaos and disorder of earth. They had together created the islands of Japan and brought them beauties and order of nature. They had created gods and goddesses to reign over the sea, the winds, the mountains, the sun, the moon, fire, and the earth. Now she was gone, and he was alone. For many days and nights he wept, and in as many As many children around him could not console him, so great was his grief. He called her by name, but there was no answer to his lonely cries. Unable to bear his solitude any longer, he resolved to journey to the underworld of darkness, from whence was derived the fiery strength of the child who had caused Izanami's death, to seek her and bring her back to the world of light. Now, interesting that fire here, again, is connected with death and destruction. As fire, as we know, yes, it can be destructive, but it can also, it also provides warmth. It cooks your food. There's elements of fire. And even, the sun is not actually acknowledged as being part of fire here, which is also interesting, since the sun is nothing but a giant ball of fire. But that aspect, has more to do with the dangerous aspects of fire. So, once he had made his decision, he became calm in spirit, but his sorrow was no less, and tears filled his eyes for his beloved wife. When he started on his journey, he knew the terrors before him. The road was filled with dangers at every point, and his enemies lay in wait for strangers who ventured toward their land. But his spirit was indomitable, and after a long journey he reached, without accident or mishap, the forbidding black region of the underworld. Days and nights he wandered among the drifting shades of the bleak country, looking for his wife, but nowhere was she to be found. At last, dejected and exhausted, he was about to lie down and rest when he saw her graceful figure ahead of him and cried out to her in joy. She turned with a cry of astonishment and, rushing to him, embraced him with tears of welcome. Izanami clasped her tightly and said, "Come, do not stay here longer. I have come to take you back with me to our lovely country, for without you there is no longer joy in our home. There are still works of divine creation to be completed, for it was so ordained by our heavenly gods. How can I do this work without you? I need you as a wife and helper." But Izanami shook her head, and her face clouded as she said, "I long to go back with you, my beloved husband, but alas, it is too late. It's no longer possible." "Why? Why?" demanded Izanagi, greatly troubled at Izanami's words. "I have eaten the food and drunk of the wine of this evil place, my august husband, and now I can never return to earth." Izanagi was chilled with dismay, but he answered boldly, "I have made this terrible journey to find you. Nothing will force me to return without you. Nothing. I will do anything that will make it possible for you to come back with me to our island home." Izanami dropped her head and thought for a long time. At last she said, "Forgive me if I seem so lacking in courage. I know the hardships you have borne for love of me. What then can I not do for the love of you? I will go and beg the Lord of this country to allow us to return together. All may yet be well. Only I must beg of you to make me a solemn promise first." "With all my heart, but tell me what it is," cried Izanagi. "Only this. I shall be away some time, and you may become weary. But I must beg you, my beloved husband, to on no account enter my room. Wait here faithfully, however tempted you may be to look for me or rest in my house for my return. Please swear that you will obey me. I give you my solemn word, my dearest wife, and on our dear love I take an oath to wait and not seek you." Satisfied, Izanami left him. Izanagi settled himself steadfastly to wait for her return and observe his sacred promise. The hours lengthened, and all around it grew darker and gloomier than before, yet she did not come. Izanagi grew increasingly anxious. He became filled with apprehension and feared some terrible thing had happened to her. Then he became aware of a most noxious smell. Overcome with a strange sense of terror and forgetting his oath to his goddess wife, he broke off one of the teeth of the comb he was wearing in his hair, and lighting it like a taper, held it before him and began looking for the source of the smell, which had now become unbearable. He traced it to a small doorway, and wrapping his scarf around his face, he entered. Holding the taper aloft, he found himself in a small chamber. As his eyes became accustomed to the flickering light and shadows, he became transfixed at the sight before him. Lying on a pallet was the sleeping form of Izanami, but despite the gentle breathing which showed she was living, her body was that of a long-dead person. From it came the nauseous stench which had puzzled him, and he gazed in horror at the decaying flesh that only a while before had been so beautiful. Crouched about her head and breast were the 8 foul demons of thunder, who regarded the terrified Izanagi with malevolent eyes and flames belching from their mouths. In sudden panic he turned and fled, dropping the taper in haste as he dashed out of the dreadful room. The noise awoke Izanami, and realizing what had happened, she was filled with anger. Rushing to the doorway, she called furiously after the fleeing Izanagi. "Is this how you keep your promise? Did I not forbid you to enter my room? You have looked at my revolting form, and you have destroyed yourself and me. You have put me to shame, and now I have no alternative but to hound you to your destruction." With this, she summoned a crowd of hideous female demons and sent them in pursuit of Izanagi. They were fleet of foot, and though he ran like the wind, they overtook him. He took the comb from the left side of his hair and threw it to the ground. From it sprang twinning grapevines, which caught the demons in a close embrace. Then bunches of grapes appeared, and the demons fell upon them. For a long time they munched greedily, until not a grape was left, and only then did they remember their quarry, who was by now far away. With fiendish speed, the demons began to gain on him again, and him, feeling them at their heels, threw down the comb from the right side of his hair, and from it burst a crop of bamboo sprouts. His pursuers stopped and ravenously began eating them. Izanagi sped on for his life, but the demons, their meal of bamboo sprouts finished, soon overtook him again. Then Izanagi made water and created a great river to flow between him and the demons, and so confused they became that they returned post-haste to Hades. Izanami was enraged when she found that Izanagi had escaped them. She called upon the 8 thunder gods clustered about her head and breast and bade them hasten after Izanagi to bring him back to Hades. Together with 1,500 attendant devils, the 8 thunder gods set off at top speed, and soon in the far distance espied the running form of Izanagi. In fast pursuit they overtook and surrounded him. Izanagi drew his sword and laid about him right and left. Hateful as the devils were, he could not find it in his heart to kill them, but he succeeded in beating them off so successfully that they retreated. Worn out and collapsing with exhaustion, Izanagi at length reached a hill called Yomi no Horazaka in the province of Izumo, where he found a peach tree. Knowing the hatred in which the demons held the peach, he gathered its fruit as missiles. When the devils returned, he hurled the peach fruit amongst them, and they broke up in confusion. The demons once again returned to Hades and informed Izanami of their unsuccessful pursuit. Her rage and mortification were unbounded, and having rained upon them threats of punishments, she determined to give chase to Izanagi herself and to drag him back into her power. Meantime, Izanagi had found a boulder of immense size. It would have needed the strength of 1,000 men to lift it, but Izanagi was endued with such noble qualities of mind and body, he was able to move it alone and thrust it before the gateway to the lower world. He sat down very weary, but serene and unperturbed, to await what might happen next. It was not long before he suddenly heard the screaming voice of Izanami, and saw her form approaching in the distance. He sprang to his feet in astonishment. He had been prepared for anything, but not for Izanami herself coming as a bitter enemy. He remembered their days of joy together, her gentleness and faithfulness, and he was filled with anguish at the change that had come over her. But there was no stopping her approach, and she was only brought to a halt when she found the great stone barring her way. "What is this?" she cried, infuriated. "Why have you put this stone against me? Move it at once." Izanagi answered quietly that it remained where it was. Whereupon the angry Izanami battered at the rock with her hands and stamped the earth so violently that the 4 corners shook and the seas washed high, but the rock remained firm. Then she appealed to him, saying, "Why did you not keep your promise to enter my room? I was humiliated, and you brought great shame to me. Why did you do this? Why, why, why?" Her voice rose to an hysterical screech. But Izanagi answered quietly, "Here and now I sever our marriage ties. Understand we are no longer man and wife. I have returned to the world of light, and I beg you to return without further words to your land of dead and darkness." With all these words, Izanagi laid down the formula for divorce for all future generations. But Izanami shook her head and cried angrily, "If you do this, my beloved brother husband, I shall retaliate with all my power and destroy every single your day 1,000 of your people." In the same quiet voice, Izanagi answered, "My beloved sister wife, if you do this, I will cause every single day 1,500 women to bear a child, and 1,500 strong people will live." Izanagi paused, then continued, "Now that the ties which bound us are broken, from this time forth our country shall be separated. Return in dutiful submission to your land of the dead, and leave me to my task of creating the living world in peace." Now there was nothing more for Izanami to say, and bowing her head, she accepted her fate and returned submissively to Hades. From that time, all bonds between them and the 2 worlds were severed. Interesting. Okay. This story is fascinating to me because you have this this idea of the union of the male and female, and now you have the male who breaks an oath. In a certain sense, he's a lawbreaker. Izanami may have been the first lawbreaker by not letting him speak first, but now he has actually decided he's going to enter the realm of the underworld, which is a realm of the feminine. And of course, in this place, he encounters the dark feminine. He encounters the hag figures, the thunder deities, which is interesting. Because again, I think as I'd mentioned, thunder and storm deities tend to be more associated with. They tend to be associated in Western or Near Eastern to Western religion. They tend to be the kings of the gods. But as we see. And actually, even in India, you have Indra, who is the god. Although Indra is far from perfect in the way that he behaves. So we don't necessarily see the same assumption about the gods of thunder. Just here, as we also don't see it about the god of fire. They're both considered to be represent something that's very destructive. And Izanami, as you see the quality of changes, she shrieks at her husband. She retaliates. She goes after him for wronging her, okay? So now what we have is we have an injustice, okay? Now, why do I particularly say it this way? Okay, I want to talk about the number 8 here, because the number 8 comes up a lot. You even see it with the 8 hags from the underworld, the 8 thunder deities, the 8 islands of Japan, the 8, everything's 8. In fact, one thing this particular version of the story doesn't mention is that their house, which is, what do they call it? The palace is called Yahiro Dono, and one hero is approximately 1.82 meters, so it's an 8-hero palace, okay, which they said, would have been like 90 feet high. 14.6, is that right? I don't know. I have to, I'm thinking it's somewhere around 80 feet, maybe, because 14, a meter is approximately 3 feet. So so you have, but nonetheless, you have these idea of the 8s. Now, in archetypal language, okay, what we will also see, for example, in the tarot, is the number 8 is the number of balance, okay? All the 8s. In the minor arcana, you have the 8 of wands, you have the 8 of cups, you have the 8 of swords, and the 8 of pentacles. And so you have the idea of the prudence and the action of wands and pentacles, tempered by the weariness and the interference that are indicated, the stuckness that are indicated in the other 2 8s. And, each of the cards tend to balance out the other. In the major arcana, you have the justice card, okay? At least in this particular, conception. Sometimes it's switched around with strength. But justice is actually the position there because justice has to do with balance, okay? And then, of course, the other card is the Star of Hope. And the star, and this positive thing, represents potential. It represents the ability to do things, the ability to, fulfill one's wishes, or to have these things. So, very interestingly, we have this idea of, you definitely have this dynamic within this myth of balancing things, creating the earth through balance. And then, of course, you have the whole dynamic of the underworld, which, again, like the underworld in a lot of cultures, follows a lot of different rules. And it's considered, a place of darkness. It's considered to be a gloomy place. Here we have, again, light associated with creation and with happiness and with all of these things. And you see the darkness being associated with more destructive elements. Now, the hags who follow him, as I've mentioned, who devour things along the way. I believe I said this in the Oni episode also. There's definitely the sense of devouring, of the idea of the devouring mother, for instance, as an archetype. That's an aspect of what they call the terrible mother. And so through his actions, through his injustice, imbalance, breaking of an oath, through her actions, she ends up creating this sort of flaccid leech boy child. They don't really say, she does create another child, another island, but they don't really say much about that. They just talk about the other child, who eventually becomes a symbol of good luck. So even though she ends up transgressing a rule, the results ultimately, they're easily rectified. It's not so terrible. He decides to make this mistake. He ventures incorrectly into the feminine. Even in asking her to give birth to the god of fire, in a way, is, he also has asked her to act outside of what maybe might be considered to be her role, or what might end up being considered to be an imbalance in her role. And so the whole thing has set in cycle. I mean, an important cycle, because death is part of life. But in that, in that extremity, you end up creating a situation of death, and of decay. And you also see, on a more superficial level, how the woman he loved who was so beautiful is, of course, I don't think anybody would want to fall in love with somebody who was like walking around maggot encrusted like a zombie. But it's funny, she's humiliated by it. Like, don't look at me like this. It's kind of like, waking up and having people not see you, with your hair washed or your makeup on or whatever. And, it's obviously a lot more extreme than that. But the idea of her as decayed, which drives him away. And so what he sees is this hag element. So again, there's this commentary on the relationship between the masculine and the feminine, and the way the masculine tends to be drawn in, to certain things. But she again always acts the role, when she is alive, of the dutiful wife. So she, so her living form is more what we think of as that virginal Mary type of way, other than her aggressiveness, the first time they meet, which again can create a situation of something that is considered to be flaccid or less potent. A creature of water as opposed to a creature of what is either considered to be solid or considered to be associated with the more fiery, active principles. But then when he violates things, now he's trying to overturn the realms of death, and that in itself is a very destructive act and threatens to destroy him. So at that point, there's a divorce that happens. And so the god and goddess of creation are now separated, and now life and death are now separated. And that's an interesting kind of disenfranchisement to me. I don't tend to see Far Eastern religion as, I think there's still definitely an element of balance, but the way in which vows were disrupted or oaths were broken ends up leading to, a separation where creation and destruction are almost bitter enemies of each other. And, although ultimately Izanami is forced to yield, it's not, like a lot of these stories, it's meant to demonstrate a dynamic that's present in the world, whether we consider it an ideal one or not. Okay, that's all I want to say about this. And I think, I sort of woven my commentary into the story itself this time. So I will leave off, and I've got a couple more Chinese and Japanese myths and ghosts to go over for the next couple of episodes, and then we'll be moving on to a couple more from India. That's it for me for this episode. Please check out Chthonia.net for my podcasts, other work, all kinds of things related to that. And also, please, if you want to support my work, patreon.com/Chthonia. There are, I do put out things like special episodes, and occasionally, as I have, offer new things. I can have discounts on the books or giveaways, or, and then when eventually when classes come out, I will be, there's a, discounted rate for people who are patrons as well. And I'm hoping also to come up with some more, get more creative with some of the rewards, because, it's been mainly, first access to episodes, of course, but I'd like to be able to provide some other things. So with that, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next episode.